January 20th, 12:01 p.m. The new president is supposed to be sworn in. The old president is supposed to be gone. But what if they're not? What if a sitting president simply refuses to leave the White House after losing an election? This has never happened in 248 years of American history. Every president who lost or termed out has peacefully transferred power. Washington set the precedent. It's become sacred tradition. But tradition isn't law, and law requires enforcement. So who enforces it? The Secret Service, the military, the Supreme Court, Congress. And what happens in those first 24 hours when nobody's quite sure who's actually in charge of the nuclear codes? Today we're breaking down the exact constitutional, legal, and military mechanisms that would activate in the most dangerous scenario in American democracy, hour by hour, decision by decision. Because the answer isn't what you think. This is the crisis nobody wants to talk about, but everyone needs to understand. Let's break it down. Welcome to Battlefield Insights. Before we start, let's be crystal clear. This is constitutional and legal analysis based on the actual mechanisms in U.S. law. This is not about any specific president, past or future. This is about the system. We're going to walk through what the Constitution says, what legal scholars agree on, what military protocol dictates, and where the gray areas exist. Because yes, there are gray areas. And they're terrifying. Hit subscribe because this gets complicated fast. Let's start with what the law actually says. The 20th Amendment to the Constitution is explicit. The terms of the President and Vice President shall end at noon on the 20th day of January. Not should end, not might end, shall end. It's automatic. It's not negotiable. At 12:00 p.m. on January 20th, the old president's legal authority to command the military, access classified information, issue executive orders, or make any decision as president simply ceases to exist. By law, they are now a private citizen, whether they leave the building or not. And here's the critical part. There is never a gap. The moment one president's term ends, another begins. If the president-elect has been certified and takes the oath, they are the president. If something prevents that, the Presidential Succession Act kicks in automatically. The vice president becomes president, then the Speaker of the House, then the president pro tempore of the Senate. But here's where it gets complicated. The law is clear about WHO has authority, but the Constitution doesn't spell out WHO enforces the transfer if someone refuses. Is it the Secret Service, the military, the courts, Congress? That's the terrifying question. Throughout American history, this has never been tested. Nixon resigned before being removed. Every defeated president has left voluntarily. We've had 46 presidents and 46 peaceful transfers. But peaceful transfer requires consent. What happens when consent disappears? Constitutional law professor Michael Gerhardt at UNC said, "The Constitution tells us who is president. It doesn't tell us how to physically remove someone who disagrees." That gap? That's where the crisis lives. And that gap has never been closed because it's never needed to be. So we have crystal clear law about authority and complete ambiguity about enforcement, which means we need to look at who actually has the power to act. Let's start with the people with guns, the Secret Service. The Secret Service. Their job is to protect the president. But at 12:01 p.m. on January 20th, if a new president has been sworn in, their job shifts to protecting that person. The former president is now a former president. They still get protection, but it's different. So whose orders do they follow? Here's the nightmare scenario. It's 12:01 p.m. The president-elect has taken the oath of office somewhere else, maybe at the Capitol, maybe at an undisclosed location if there's a security concern. That person is now legally the president, but the former president is still in the Oval Office refusing to leave. The Secret Service has two people both claiming to be commander-in-chief. Legally, it's clear. The new president is the president. The Secret Service protects the president. Therefore, they should be protecting the new president and treating the old one as a protectee, not the sitting president. But who gives that order? The director of the Secret Service reports to the Secretary of Homeland Security, who serves at the pleasure of which president? The Secret Service has never had to forcibly remove anyone from the White House. There's no protocol for it. They're not law enforcement in the traditional sense. They don't arrest the president. They protect whoever is president. But determining who that is when both people claim the office, that's not in the manual. In 1974, when Nixon resigned, the Secret Service seamlessly shifted to Ford. Easy. Nixon cooperated. But in our scenario, the former president is claiming the election was invalid, that they are still president, that everyone else is committing a coup. Do Secret Service agents physically escort them out? Do they call local DC police? Do they do nothing? The answer is, nobody knows. It's never happened. The Secret Service operates on the assumption that presidents follow the law. But law requires enforcement. And if the Secret Service won't do it, or can't, then who? The answer is the one organization with both the authority and the capability, the United States military. The United States military, 1.3 million active duty troops, the most powerful military on Earth. Surely they can enforce the Constitution, right? Well, not exactly. And here's why it gets really complicated. Every military officer swears an oath to support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. Not to obey the president, to obey the Constitution. So if the Constitution says a new president took office at noon, military officers are oath-bound to recognize that person as commander-in-chief. Clear, right? Except for one small problem. The nuclear football. There are actually two footballs, one with the president, one with the vice president as backup. At 12:01 p.m., if the former president still has their football and refuses to hand it over, you now have a nuclear command and control crisis. Who can actually launch? The answer needs to be instant and unambiguous. But in this scenario, it's not. Here's the bigger problem. The Posse Comitatus Act. It explicitly forbids using the military for domestic law enforcement. The Army can't arrest American citizens on American soil. That's why we have civilian police. So the military can't just march into the White House and remove someone. That would be illegal. But wait, you say. What about the Insurrection Act? That allows the president to deploy troops domestically. Yes, but which president? The former president could claim they are invoking it to stop a coup. The new president could claim they are invoking it to enforce constitutional order. Two presidents, two orders, same military. Who do you obey? Here's what military historians and legal scholars agree on. The military would almost certainly refuse to get involved. Because the moment the military chooses sides in a political dispute, American democracy is over. It doesn't matter if they choose correctly. The precedent of military intervention in civilian politics is how republics die. So the Secret Service won't act without clear orders. The military can't act without violating their own doctrine, which means enforcement falls to civilian institutions, Congress, the courts, but they don't have guns. And this is where it gets truly terrifying. Congress. They certified the electoral votes. They determined who won. That certification is supposed to be final. On January 6th, Congress counts electoral votes and certifies the winner. That person becomes president on January 20th. But Congress has no police force. They can't physically enforce their certification. Could they impeach the former president? Technically, no. You can only impeach someone currently in office. At 12:01 p.m., they're not in office anymore according to the Constitution. They're just a citizen refusing to leave a building. Congress can pass resolutions, make speeches, demand compliance. But they can't force it. The Supreme Court. Surely they can rule, right? Yes, they could issue an order declaring Person X is the legal president. Person Y must vacate the White House immediately. But here's the problem. The Supreme Court has no enforcement mechanism. They issue rulings. Someone else has to enforce them. In 1832, the Supreme Court ruled against President Andrew Jackson on Cherokee rights. His response: John Marshall has made his decision. Now let him enforce it. Jackson ignored the court. The court couldn't stop him. In our scenario, if the former president ignores a Supreme Court order, who enforces it? We're back to the Secret Service and military, and we've already established they won't act. This is the constitutional crisis with no solution. So what actually happens? Here's the most likely scenario. The president-elect gets sworn in somewhere else. The Capitol, an undisclosed location, doesn't matter. At 12:01 p.m., they are the president, and the entire federal government recognizes them as such. The cabinet reports to them. The military takes orders from them. The Treasury transfers financial authority. Intelligence agencies brief them. The nuclear codes activate for them. The former president sitting in the Oval Office? They have no power. They can sit there and claim they're president, but nobody's listening. No orders are followed. No authority is recognized. The White House is just a building. The presidency is an office, a legal entity, a constitutional authority. It's not tied to a physical location. During the War of 1812, the British burned the White House. Madison was still president. He just worked somewhere else. Power is recognition, not location. Eventually, they leave. Because sitting in the White House without power is pointless. No staff, no Secret Service protection as the president. Possible criminal charges for trespassing or interference with government operations. The legal pressure becomes unbearable. The system holds, not because of force, but because power requires recognition. And if nobody recognizes you as president, if the military doesn't salute, if Congress doesn't acknowledge you, if the world treats someone else as the leader, then you're not president, no matter where you sit. That's the answer, and it's less satisfying than you hoped. That's the constitutional reality. The law is clear. The enforcement is messy. But the system survives because power is consent, not force. If you want more constitutional and political analysis from a nonpartisan perspective, subscribe. Next video. What happens if the vice president and president both die at once? Links on screen.